Okay, so we're talking today about the mental fog that is hallmark of complex PTSD. For example, have you ever had those days where it feels like your mind is wrapped in cotton? Like you just walked into a room and you can't remember what you walked in to do. Or you're trying to make a decision and yet your brain just can't seem to feel clear. Well, that mental fog is made up of three specific emotions: fear, overwhelm, and guilt. And so today I want to talk about why this happens, how it gets hardwired into our nervous system, and more importantly, how we can start breaking through that fog so that we can actually feel like we're living our life as an active participant instead of feeling like someone else is living our life for us. So that being said, let's dive in. Complex PTSD doesn't just happen. It's built slowly over time in environments where emotional safety was either inconsistent or non-existent. So I'm going to talk about three different ways this could happen and reflect for a moment in which one applies to you. So the first way this can happen is if you were punished for expressing emotions. Maybe you were told, boys don't cry. Or maybe you were told, you're making a big deal out of nothing. In other words, you were constantly made to feel bad for your feelings. And so this inadvertently teaches you that feelings aren't safe. The second thing that can happen is that you learned very quickly that if you worked really hard to suppress your needs, suppress who you are, your authenticity, and you focused on trying to make other people happy, and in other words, you were regulating their moods. You were made to feel responsible. If somebody else was upset, you were somehow made to feel responsible. So you learned to work really hard to regulate and keep other people happy. Then you learned to scan constantly, to pick up everyone's micro expressions, to know what everyone else is feeling, because you learned that it was your job to make sure everyone was okay. Something else that can happen that causes CPTSD is when you're blamed for everything that happens. So your mom is completely dysregulated because of her own trauma that she hasn't healed, but somehow it's your fault. Something happens in the house and somehow you're attacked. And so every bad thing, every challenge, every stress that your caregivers go through is interpreted through their own unhealed trauma and their projection onto you. You feel like everything is your fault. In any of those scenarios, or if all three applied to you, then you basically grew up learning that life is not safe, people are not safe, the world isn't safe, and just being you, your authentic self, is not safe. And so you develop beliefs like, I must be bad if they're upset. It must be my fault, because it's too scary to think that this is your parents' fault. Because then the very people that are responsible for keeping you safe are unsafe themselves. And that's too scary for a child to think about. My life is in the hands of someone that's not safe. No, it's easier on the body to just blame self. And so we focus on ourselves and we start thinking, if I make one mistake, I can be rejected. And if I'm rejected, I'll be abandoned. If I'm abandoned, I can die. And so we get overly focused on how we can be better, what we can do to make other people feel better and feel happy. We take on a role of managing everyone else out of a deep need to feel safe. Those beliefs were part of our survival strategy. The problem is that survival becomes our baseline. There's no space for authenticity. There's no space for creativity. Our brain is like, forget about being creative. What do I need to do to survive the next 5 minutes? And so when that becomes just another Monday, just another Tuesday, in other words, that's our day-to-day life. The constant scanning, the feeling unsafe, the constant monitoring, the constant trying to make other people feel better, suppressing self. That's when the mental fog begins. Because when you're now in survival mode 24/7, thinking clearly is not even a priority. The brain's like, forget about planning who I want to be when I grow up. Again, like I said before, I just want to survive the next 5 minutes. And I want to clearly state that the mental fog is not a sign of weakness. It's a protective response from a body that has been in crisis for far too long, from a body that has had to go through overwhelming emotions at a time when you were too young to handle them and with no support. And I say that because it's so important to understand this so that we can start having compassion for what we went through. Instead of attacking self like I am bad, we can start shifting when we understand this from I am bad to something bad happened to me. And now I get to show up for myself in a way that will help me to heal. Okay, let's break down the 3 emotions that keep us in that mental fog. Let's start with fear. When you're a child growing up in an unsafe environment, your body becomes an expert at detecting threat, whether it's real or imagined. And the reason is because since you feel unsafe, it activates the part of your brain that is responsible for your fear response, your amygdala. It's the brain's alarm center. And because it's being activated constantly, it becomes hypervigilant. And so if you were constantly provoked to fear as a child, your brain has been living with an overactive amygdala. An amygdala that is constantly searching for threat 24/7. And this happens even if you've left your childhood home, even if the people that caused the trauma are out of your life. The thing with trauma is there's no time in those areas of the brain. And so to your amygdala, it still thinks that you're not safe. And so fast forward, and now you're an adult. And after living with an overactive amygdala for so long, even minor stresses can feel like emergencies. Your heart is racing, your breathing changes, you freeze up. And so it can show up in a very overt way where you have so much fear that now you're panicking. You have tons of anxiety, but it can also show up in very covert ways, like being unable to open up an email, being unable to make a decision, or sitting on the couch for hours because the thing that you have to do, whatever that may be, feels unsafe to your body, even if you don't understand why. As an adult, living in chronic fear takes us out of our prefrontal cortex, which is where our thinking, our reasoning, our planning, our creativity take place. We're not even in that area of the brain. We're in our limbic system, our limbic network, which is like our midbrain, our survival brain. And we stay stuck there. And so that leads me to the second emotion that makes up the mental fog that is hallmark of CPTSD, and that's overwhelm. Imagine your brain like a computer that has too many tabs open up. And ask my kids, I'm so guilty of this. My computer's always crashing because I never close my tabs. Fear is already taking up half of our RAM, or our random access memory. Now add overwhelm, which can include a hyper-awareness of the needs of others while being completely blind to the needs of yourself. It could include self-criticism, constantly attacking self, a harsh inner critic, and suppressing our needs and feelings. And so our system crashes when we're too activated to think, but we're too frozen to move. In childhood, oftentimes we were in a state of freeze because we were too small to fight or flee. And so we got stuck in that emotional state, and that bleeds into our adult life as well. It turns into procrastination, social withdrawal, or a brain fog so thick we can't even see our next step. And as if those two things aren't enough to keep us in a state of mental fog, let's add guilt into the mix. We can view guilt as like the silent saboteur. And this one runs deep because if as a child you were made to feel responsible for other people's feelings, then you probably have a very delicate guilt wound. And that wound still speaks whenever we're thinking things, even unconsciously, like, it's my fault they're upset. If I say no, I'm selfish. I should have done more. And the difficult thing that makes it hard to heal from this is that guilt comes up not from a place of logic, but from a place of body memory, a survival sequence that's buried deep in your subconscious mind and in your nervous system. Because back then, guilt was a survival strategy that kept you connected or attached. And attachment for a child equals survival. Okay, so as trauma survivors that were provoked to a tremendous amount of fear, overwhelm, and guilt, our body developed amazing coping strategies that kept us safe when we were children, but sadly they hold us back from being able to be who we truly are as adults. So the strategies that we learn to do, well, we learn to numb out. We learn to overanalyze and be up in our heads. We learn to avoid risk, to say yes to keep peace even when our body wanted to say no, and to stay busy in order to outrun our feelings that were so big when we were small and no one helped us with. So we're fleeing our feelings by overdoing. As adults, we may over-identify with those characteristics, but those characteristics, they are not who you are. They are not even flaws. When we were children, those were our lifelines. They saved us and got us through what we were not equipped to process at the time. But now, those strategies wind up keeping us stuck in that same mental fog. And the truth is, we cannot build a new life on emergency wiring. So if you're like, yes, Michele, I get it. Thanks for the validation, but what do I do about it? Let's talk about how we can start to break free out of this mental fog. The first thing I want to say is that we don't do this through sheer willpower or by whipping our body into shape, so to speak, or by trying to have the mind force the body to do what it thinks it should do. Nor do we ignore what happened and go into this positive thinking of life is great and I'm just going to close the door to that. Guess what? Closing the door to that is not the answer either. So what's the balance? Just like a home whose wiring system is outdated has to have an electrician come in and rewire the home to have the updated electrical system put in, we have to update our nervous system. We're living with wiring from the past, and it's not advantageous for who we are as adults. So we have to change that wiring. We need to gently retrain our nervous system to realize that it's safe now. It's safe so that it can come out of survival. I will be honest, doing this work is challenging alone because think about it. If you have a body that is wired to not feel safe and you're trying to create safety from a place of not safe, it's very challenging. But getting help is helpful because now you have the co-regulation of someone else's nervous system to help you to build that capacity. So remember, if you're trying to apply tips to help your traumatized nervous system to feel safe again, and it's too overwhelming and it's too hard, that's when you want to reach out for help. Finding a somatic experiencing practitioner, if not myself, then somebody else that is going to help you not just talk about your trauma, but to work with it on a body level. Or you can check out my live weekly Zoom meetings where I meet with a group of survivors from all over the world, and we do this healing work in community. But regardless, I do want to leave you with some tips. So the first tip I want to give you is to start noticing micro moments of safety. Every time you notice something safe in your environment, whether it's a warm cup of tea, a bird outside, the feeling of a soft blanket, notice it. Almost take a picture for your nervous system and point it out. Tell yourself, I'm safe right now. I know it sounds simple, but it signals to your body we're not in the past anymore. Tip number 2 is to practice body-led decisions. So instead of overthinking, or actually when you notice yourself going into overthinking, pause and ask yourself, when I think about making this decision, does this feel expansive or constrictive? Expansion is your body's way of saying, yes, let's do it. Constriction is your body's way of saying no. You could also ask yourself, do I feel more like myself or less like myself when I make this decision? You see, your body holds wisdom that your brain forgot how to access. And so we start building trust one choice at a time. And the last tip has to do with guilt, learning to reframe it with compassion. We can't stop the guilt from coming up. It's coming up from our subconscious. So we're not choosing it. So when it does creep in, pause and ask yourself, who taught me I was hard for having needs? Or who taught me how to feel this way? Guilt loses power when we see it for what it is, which is a relic of survival, not a reflection of your worth. And so in conclusion, remember, if you're in a state of mental fog, the fog isn't a flaw, it's actually a signal from a nervous system that's been protecting you for so very long. But now, what we want to help our nervous system to see is that we're allowed to exhale, we're allowed to pause, and we're allowed to come back home into our bodies. something powerful that I learned on my own journey is that healing isn't about fixing what's broken. It's about reclaiming what was always yours. Your clarity, your voice, your peace. Remember, you don't have to walk through the fog alone. If this message resonated with you, I invite you to like, share, and subscribe, not just to support this channel, but because every time we tell the truth about our trauma, we make space for someone else to heal too. So until next time, and remember to be gentle with yourselves.